we really conceived this as in response to the recognition that we need more opportunities to showcase women researchers, but also to highlight the gendered nature of water in people's research. And so some people are looking at gender within their research, but others aren't. And so some people we're putting on the spot as they come to speak to us and asking them, okay, what are some of the gendered implications, or what is the gendered nature of some of the research that is the work that you're doing, but that you're not actually looking at the moment. And we also conceived the lecture series to draw attention to the lack of women and opportunities, particularly for young professionals in water research that we've seen through publications from Water and Health in the Lancet, in Nature, in terms of the American Geophysical Union. And each of our lectures will focus on a particular theme, and today we're going to be looking at ecosystems and ecosystem services. And water-related ecosystem services range from the fish that we catch and that we eat, right the way through to the provision of water itself. And there are other ecosystem services that are supported by water, such as water purification and food and medicines and climate regulation. And so this is why we wanted to choose this as a theme, because not only is water such a key element of ecosystem services, but the gendered nature of who accesses the value that people get from ecosystem services, how they're able to access these ecosystem services is gendered as well in terms of space, place, and power. And so that's really what we wanted to look at. We do have, as Holly mentioned, a great panel of speakers, and without any further ado, I'll let Holly introduce them to you.
I'll do the introductions one at a time here. So we're going to have about a 10 or 12 minute presentation from our three speakers, and then we'll do sort of a little bit of a moderated discussion with you and open it up to questions from the audience. So our first speaker today is Dr. Heidi Swanson. Heidi is an assistant professor and university research chair at the University of Waterloo. She has experience in aquatic ecology, fish ecology, and contaminant bioaccumulation. She tackles a variety of community-driven research questions in Canada's north. Heidi worked in the nonprofit industry and the government sector before coming to academia. So in Heidi's research, her and her grad students work to understand what drives the variability in fish mercury levels and fish nutrient levels. Her overall goal is to empower Northerners in choosing the safest, healthiest sources of subsistence fish. You get that right? So Heidi, please join us for your talk. Heidi just flew in this morning from Waterloo after a bit of a delay yesterday, so we're really thankful that you made the trip.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for coming today. I was just chatting with one of my co-speakers. I decided not to put a lot of science in this talk. There is some, but a lot of it is just a bit of a story, which is, I think, more and more the way my research is going. So overall, my research program, we look at the safety and security of traditional fish sources in the north. And this photo was taken at Big Island Lake by actually my friend Shelley, who's sitting right there, who comes up to work with me in the field every summer. I'm going to be talking about research that has primarily been conducted in the Decho region of the Northwest Territories, but our research group works across the north in Nunavut, Yukon, Northwest Territories, as well as Alaska. So we interact with a lot of partners and groups, and I would just like to acknowledge a lot of those people here because, as you all know, it takes a village to get this kind of stuff done. So today's theme, of course, is ecosystem services, and about 7 years ago, when I first started my position, actually I hadn't even started my position yet at Waterloo. I was still at University of Alberta, and my phone rang. I was a postdoc, and there was this voice on the other end of the line that I instantly recognized was a northerner, because they're usually super informal. And he's like, hey, Heidi, it's George. And I was like, George. I have really terrible face name recognition, so I'm usually searching for, yeah, I've met you in the past, but I have no context. And I said, oh, hi, George. And you know when you're like pretending that you remember who this person is, I'm kind of playing along. He's like, yeah, so you work on mercury and fish. And I was like, yep, still have no idea who George is. So George is the coordinator for the DACHO AROM program, the Aboriginal Aquatic Resources and Oceans Management Program in the DACHO region of the Northwest Territories. And he said, Heidi, we really want someone to come up here and help us figure out why in some lakes, fish mercury levels are high enough that there's consumption guidelines on them. So there's advisories. So that means that there'll be a sign at the lake and there's a posting on the web saying you should only eat a certain number of fish, especially if you're a pregnant woman or a young child. You can only eat so many fish of so many sizes. And the communities are asking me why some fish are safe to eat and why some aren't. Why are there differences among the lakes? And they're also asking me what's going to happen with climate change. Is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? How do we predict the changes? And so we kind of hatched this plan, and it's been going ever since. And now George, his wife, I call my almost mom. I basically live at their house in Hay River when we mobilize, and they're like family. And we've been working together for the last 7 years. And it all started from this sign. So you can see this is a consumption advisory sign put up by GNWT, Government of Northwest Territories Health and Social Services. It's a consumption advisory in 3 languages, French, English, and Denijati. This one is still standing. Usually they're full of bullet holes and knocked over because people don't like them. Why? Like, why would they want to see that on their traditional fishing lakes? So this map is just highlighting some of the communities that we work in across the north. And again, I'm going to be focusing on the DACHO region. And my research has really, I started as a contaminant ecotox person, fish ecology, and it's really morphed into let's find the best way to balance the risks and benefits of consuming traditional foods, especially fish. Fish are really important sources of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, selenium, zinc, micronutrients, but more importantly, for cultural and spiritual well-being, which I've learned more and more over the last 7 years. So there are safe sources of fish in every lake. How do we find them? And what do we think is going to happen in the future? And that's what we started tackling with George. So no matter where I go in the north, if it's a community meeting or a Hunters and Trappers organization meeting or an AROM meeting, I get asked the question, can we eat the fish and drink the water, and will our grandchildren be able to do the same? And why can we eat fish from some lakes and not from other lakes? What's the difference? Some of these lakes are only 2 or 3 kilometers apart, and the mercury concentrations are 3 times above guideline in one lake and perfectly safe in another. What's the difference? And then how will climate change and resource development affect the safety of our fish food sources? So this is what we try to tackle in our research program. Mercury, as many of you know, is incredibly complicated. And so on the top half of this little picture are all of the things about the catchment and the lake chemistry that can affect mercury levels in fish. The pH of the water, the dissolved oxygen, dissolved organic carbon, so how tea-colored the water is, the depth, what's in the catchment? Is it forested? Is it wetlands? That has a huge influence. We're going to talk about that later when TK comes in. What are the chlorophyll A concentrations, which means how much algae is there in the lake? Is it green? Is it clear? The ion concentrations. And then on the bottom are all of the things about the fish that can affect the mercury concentration. How old is the fish? How big is it? What other fish are in the lake? How fast do they grow? What trophic level do they feed in? Do they feed inshore or offshore? And it's super complicated because all of these factors, the ones about lake water chemistry, can affect ecology, which then affect mercury, or you can have direct effects of these on mercury biogeochemistry. So we're trying to tease all this apart, and one of the really rewarding things of working closely with communities is I've morphed, I don't know what I've morphed into, but definitely more of an ecosystem ecologist where we're considering land-water interactions, how things interact within the lake, taking the perspective that everything is connected, including the humans in these systems. And it has a profound effect on what ends up in the fish and then how we manage it. So the study that I wanted to talk to you about today, and primarily I want to talk about this one because it is a long-running program, It's also the one that's furthest along and supported by Global Water Futures, so Northern Water Futures out of Laurier. For the last 8 seasons, we've gone up for 3 to 4 weeks every year and sampled lakes that are selected by the communities. So we're working with 6 nations, and 6 of these lakes are remote fly-in, so it's considerable logistics. Charter planes, we need cooks and food and camp and lots of chainsaws. Lots of chainsaws. That's the biggest difference between working between Nunavut and the Dehcho, because there's wood, you can burn it. I like the Northwest Territories, there's heat. We've sampled 10 lakes between 2013 and 2018. Several of them we've sampled multiple times. So sometimes we also manage to partner this with a youth camp. So we have ecology camp that are organized by the communities. There's TK and science components, and then they help us sample. The youth can help us sample. We've spent more than 200 person days on the land with guardians that are selected. Now it's actually a formal program, the Indigenous Guardians Program, which is fantastic. The Dehcho AROM program also hires Indigenous monitors every summer to monitor the aquatic resources. So they come out with us sampling. And then we have camp helpers and community samplers as well. It's incredibly rewarding, and it's chaos every summer, right? Like you show up and we just roll with lots of different things because there's logistics and weather. And 2014, the year everything burned, huge forest fires all through the NWT. And we sample everything that we can come up with from a Western science perspective, but it's evolved to be so much more over the years because of input from the elders and guardians on the land. So we sample fish, water, invertebrates, sediments, catchment composition. We look at quality and quantity of DOC. Some of the elders started pointing out to me, oh, Heidi, there's these permafrost slumps. Can we sample those? And sure enough, they were sky high in organic mercury coming into the system. Or, Heidi, there's more beavers here than there were last year. Can we sample that? Super high methyl mercury. Beaver ponds are often really high in methyl mercury because when the beavers build a dam, it floods, and the degradation of organic matter fuels methylation of mercury. And so it's the guardians on the land that are helping us pinpoint these different sources. These are some of the pictures. This particular picture, we were doing everything by canoe, one lake this last summer, because there may or may not have been a small incident getting the outboard off the floatplane. May or may not be at the bottom of the lake. We got it back, so we were going non-powered on that lake. This is one of the monitors that I've been working with for the last 6 or 7 years. This is Stephen, and Stephen actually had a really great idea, and he was asking us, hey guys, we don't know what the depth is of any of these lakes. A lot of the elders who traditionally fish the lakes are no longer around, and so people have a fairly good sense of where the good fishing holes are, but with climate change, there's new reefs showing up and shoals. And so we're now doing bathymetry maps for all of the lakes, which everyone is pretty keen on. And this is Elsie. And one of the things that we started doing, when I look back at my PhD and how we sampled fish, it was really terrible. We just sampled fish for science, and then whatever happened, happened. And we're quite careful in the lakes that we know the fish have low mercury, or whitefish, which always have low mercury, so there's safe sources of fish in every lake. We take the science sample, and then the rest of it is prepared for dry fish. And so Elsie was teaching me how to make dene dry fish, which is hilarious. The white girl did not do super well at this. My first dry fish was in 7 pieces. I've gotten a little better, but I'm not super fast. And so we freeze fillets, freeze whole carcasses, dry the fish, and then bring them back into the community. But this last summer, one of the elders said, oh, hey, Heidi, is the mercury different if the fish are smoked versus whether they're fresh? And I have no idea. Let's sample it. So there's lots of new innovative ideas that have come up through this research. I will point out here, because we are talking about women in water, that in this particular region, it is the men who do the fishing. Women help prepare the fish, but it's the men who are on the water. And so I work primarily with male guardians. Women are hired to help cook, usually. And now, in parts of the Dehcho region, young girls are being encouraged to drum, so we're hopeful that they'll be able to start helping on the water. But I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, too, from my own experience. So 7 years, we probably have figured a few things out from a whole ecosystem study. The walleye mercury concentrations in the Decho range from being less than half of the commercial guideline in Canada for Health Canada to 4 times the guideline. And we've actually found that most of that variability, 92% in fact of the variability, can be explained by chlorophyll A in the lakes, which is really interesting and great because we can actually predict to some extent what's going to happen. So what happens when you have more chlorophyll A in a lake or more algae is you have more algae at the base of the food chain to dilute that burden of mercury out. That's one thing that happens. The second thing that happens is that the fish grow more quickly, and fish that grow more quickly have less mercury. And so we found that the lakes that are more productive, they have more algae, they have lower mercury concentrations. So when we're making predictions about climate change, if primary productivity is going to increase, we're actually predicting a decrease in mercury levels in some of these lakes for walleye, which is walleye in the Decho are both commercially harvested and for subsistence reasons. Northern pike are only harvested for subsistence reasons, and this story is a lot more complicated. And what we found out is that in lakes, who here uses stable isotopes at all? Anyone? Okay, so yes, okay. So delta 13C, we can use a stable isotope tracer to figure out to what extent the pike are feeding off in the middle of the lake versus inshore. We often think of pike as a lunge predator inshore. It turns out that a lot of them actually feed offshore, and when they feed offshore, they grow more slowly for several reasons. They grow more slowly, they accumulate more mercury. So then you might think, well, why would they be feeding offshore? And it turns out that there's a correlation with secchi depth. So pike, which are a visual predator, are more likely to be feeding offshore when the lakes are clear. And the lakes are more likely to be clear when there's more forest in the catchment. So here we've got these land-water connections that we can start building models in terms of climate change. This is an example of some of our communications which have to be approved by GNWT Health and Social Services. But when we show graphs to communities often, well, any graph, I mean, graphs are boring. We were having a hard time communicating the different results until Dr. Marlene Evans, who's actually here in Saskatoon, just turned the data points into fish. And all of a sudden, everyone can understand all of the consumption advisories. So moving beyond natural science, I was speaking with Corinne earlier about how I feel like I'm constantly straddling this line now between being a natural scientist but I'm more interested sometimes in the public health implications or in the social science implications. So all of the fish that we collect are also analyzed for fatty acid levels, and then they go into probabilistic dose models for humans. We also are sampling the humans' hair, blood, and urine for mercury levels, because there's no point scaring people about mercury in their fish if the levels in humans are low, right? So why don't we just look at the humans to start with and avoid this whole risk communication problem in the first place? TK science and management. So one of the lakes, that last lake I showed you with all those red fish, one of the elders said to me, you know, Heidi, that lake used to be really heavily fished by one particular elder, and that elder passed away and no one's taken over the fishery. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about the fact that when I bring up a net, it has all the same size fish in it, which got me thinking that there's a density problem, that the humans in this case aren't harvesting the lake enough. So the community initiated, with our support, their own fish down. So we've now been into Sanguez 4 times, and we're selectively fishing the largest, oldest pike out of the population so that the ones that are left can grow faster. And it's been great for community engagement. We now have a new cabin. It's being linked to a traditional trails program. It's fantastic. I mentioned about the thaw slumps earlier, and now we're looking at beaver ponds. And in fact, one of the chiefs I work with, he's the real go-getter type of guy, and he was like, Heidi, just come up in March and we'll blow up the beaver dams. And I was like, okay, let's sample first. He's like, nope, blowing them up. So they could be blown up, I'm not sure. We'll find out this summer. But the point is, so a lot of people ask about, and when we're writing grants, how are you integrating traditional knowledge into the science? How do you link traditional knowledge into the science? I'm from the prairies. I was kind of brought up with like a giver sort of attitude, and I get really frustrated sitting around talking. And I find it just sort of happens if you live with people in camps for weeks on end on the land. You start talking to each other, and those links and different perspectives come together in a much more natural way than if you're just sitting around a boardroom table under fluorescent lights. So I am a woman in science. There's lots of women in biology. There's not a lot of women in fisheries ecology. And my specialty is actually Arctic char. I was at a conference in June last year, and they were bragging that there was 22% women at the conference, and of 99 attendees, there were 3 female professors. So that's one of my identities. When I go up north, I'm also white, and I'm a white woman. And this has posed challenges. In the Dene region, as I mentioned, women are thought to be bad luck on the water, and they're thought to be bad luck for fishing, which is a problem when I'm in charge of getting the fish sometimes. And so it just took a lot of, you get to know people, right? Trust and time, and a lot of listening. And so the role of women really differs with respect to where I am. In the Inuit regions where I work, it's not a problem for me to be on the water. The other thing is that on some of the Dene lands, it's considered really bad for women to be menstruating and on the land, which can get really awkward when I'm sneaking to the outhouse, trying to keep it hidden. But all of those things I found over the last 8 years working with the same people for weeks and weeks and weeks, and everything goes wrong, right? So it's hilarious. There's lots of humor, there's lots of time around the campfire, and all of those barriers, they start to be less of a problem. It certainly has brought me a lot more perspective. I read a lot more broadly. I think about ecosystems a lot differently. I think about human role in the ecosystem. I hope I'm starting to understand some of the perspective of the lands on which I work, but I'm just starting out. I'm a newbie. However, no matter which group that I've worked with, the core values are that water is life. And one of the people I work with actually out of Litzel, we were having a workshop in December. She put it so well, I thought. And it's everyone's opinion, everyone has a different opinion. But we were talking about traditional knowledge in Western science, and it was turning into kind of more of a semantic discussion. And she stood up, and she was like, "You guys can call it whatever you want. We call it living." And I was like, cool. I think that's for the type of research that we're doing up there, it works really well. So I think that's where I want to stop, and I would just like to thank everyone for their attention. Merci.
Thank you, Heidi. So we'll move right into our next speaker here. We have Dr. Michelle Johnson-Jennings here with us from the University of Saskatchewan. She is also a Choctaw, and she is a Canada Research Chair for Indigenous Community Engaged Research nominee. She is an Associate Professor in Indigenous Studies, and she's also a licensed eligible clinical health psychologist, if I get it right. Dr. Johnson-Jennings specializes in Indigenous community engaged water and land-based healing interventions that seek to lower chronic disease prevention and addictions. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Also wanted to note you're the mother of 4. Great, welcome to the stage.
Well, halito, so Jepiet Michelle Johnson-Jennings, Mijaina Inki Chokopuna, Choctaw Siohoke, and I am a bit shorter, so I'm just going to lower that. I want to give just a land acknowledgement. I know it's already been given, but just to recognize the ancestors of this land, the ancestors that I bring in with me, and the ancestors that you bring in with yourself today. And for the ancestors, which I'll be speaking about their knowledge, just their guidance as we go through the presentation. So I am Choctaw. I'll be talking with you about some of the work I've done with United Homa Nation, and we do overlap. We were one tribe not too long ago, and then in about the 1700s, they broke off and became their own nation. We are people who are very familiar with stickballs. If you've heard of playing lacrosse, it actually came from Choctaws in the late 1500s. Sorry, I didn't realize my slides were on their own timing schedule. So we do settle our grievances that way. Today, my people are from the southeastern part of the United States, within Oklahoma. We do have a mountain range, although it's not nearly as large as the Rocky Mountains here, but it is an older mountain range, and our youth still practice a lot of our traditional ways today. Today, I just want to talk with you briefly about the context for Indigenous Homa women in particular, as well as a brief water health intervention that we did in 2016, and how that led to some healing within the Indigenous community, and really their development of a health framework in which to guide some of their present initiatives. So, but before I tell you that, I want to tell you just briefly an old Muskogean story that applies to both the Choctaw Nation and myself, as well as the Homa Nation. So a long time ago, Chukfi, which was our trickster the rabbit, was betting through this moccasin game. And so he bet everyone in the town and kept winning and winning and winning. And finally, he had no one else left to bet. So he decided, well, I'll bet Mother Earth. I'm sure she'll be up for a good game. So he went to speak with Mother Earth and said, would you mind wagering with me a bit on this moccasin game? I'm sure you'll win, but it'd be fun. And so Mother Earth said, yeah, I will. And so Chukfi bet and lost. So first Chukfi lost his belongings to Mother Earth. Then he lost his home to Mother Earth and thought, oh no, I got this, I can surely win. So next he bet his forest. Mother Earth took the forest back. Then Chukfi started getting desperate and said, oh, what can I wager now? He said, Mother Earth, I will bet you all the water that there is, and it will be yours to keep just for you. Now all the other animals and the humans were gasping at this point, like, no, you can't bet that, not our water, Chukfi. Chukfi said, oh, it'll be fine, I'll win it all back, it'll be ours forever. So Chukfi went ahead and bet, and you can imagine Mother Earth won this as well. So Mother Earth in her wisdom hid the water away from everyone, all creatures. And before you know it, though, the woodpecker was fluttering about and noticed these river canes swelling. Started to peck a little bit at them to see what was inside. And the water began to be released again back to the people. And the people were ecstatic, and the animals were ecstatic, and all of creation were very happy that this water was released. And so I tell you this story today because for one, we have to establish space within the academy and within a lot of our research for Indigenous knowledge. And the recognition that a lot of the Indigenous stories are not just related to fairy tales or myths or things that we tell our children, but actually they establish a precedence for how we interact with the earth, with the land, and with our waters. And within that story, we know that we have an interrelationship with nature. We know that water is very sacred and that we need to be humble when we interact with water. Actually, in a lot of our Indigenous beliefs and ways, water has a personhood. The Wanganui River in New Zealand, if you've heard recently, was granted personhood rights. And for Indigenous communities, water continues to have personhood and rights that we should respect. It's a very sacred gift that we have. And what one person does to water affects us all. Now, we also know that illnesses arise from water. When I do my work with Indigenous communities, I find most often when we ask what is health, water comes up almost always. Pollution of water means ill health. Poor treatment of water means ill health. But health, good water means good health, right? So not too long ago, back in 2015, I was contacted by the United Homa Nation. Dr. Shenandoah Beloit, as well as Dr. Karina Walters, and I got together and spoke with the health director at the time, Lenore Carroll, and she said they wanted to do a project around health and well-being. And I don't know if you know, but actually United Homa Nation is in the lower part of the southeastern part of the United States. They were up north originally, and then they were chased down and massacred along the way and sought refuge in the bayou to survive, where they currently reside today. They're also the tribe that's experiencing thousands of acres loss of land each day due to climate change, but also a lot from the oil companies who have come through, barged through their property, and let in brackish water. They also have 17,000 currently enrolled members, and they're facing great climate change. Actually, and I don't know if you've heard, but recently they have a whole island that has to be relocated because of the current climate change. The water's come up too high. It includes the Chitimacha, Biloxi, and Choctaw Nation, as well as United Homa Nation members. So they're in a state of crisis. And as the water levels are rising, their health is also decreasing, right? Because when they called, they said, we can't even do gardening. We try to do raised beds, but because of the water coming in, and because of the hurricanes, and because of the increase of these factors, every time we try to do even container gardens, they get washed away. And so we're really at a point that we need something drastic to be done. And so we went and met with them. And what they wanted to do was a health intervention similar to some other work I've done around land-based healing. They wanted to retrace their ancestral route, reestablish their commitment to health, and reestablish some control over their own health. And part of that meant they wanted to address the trauma that's occurred. And sorry about that. And the trauma that's happening is really about around the waters, but also around the land. And they believe that's really fueled type 2 diabetes, it's a fueled addiction, and it's really taken away a loss of their cultural traditions. They can't have access to their traditional homelands, their ceremonial lands, their sacred lands, due to the loss of access because of the waters rising. At one point, they were able to canoe and get to one another's properties quite easily, and today we had to go on 3- and 4-hour car rides to get from one community to another because of the loss of land. Also within this water trauma that's been occurring within their nation, there's been harm done to the water carriers. And from an Indigenous perspective, women are the water carriers. They carry the sacred waters for birth. They connect each person to the ancestors through their sacred waters. And so the women often take the lead, especially around health and different initiatives within a community. Recently, the women also met with us, and the elders spoke to us about the Katrina hurricane that came through and the devastation that it caused, as well as a BP oil spill. We actually, when I first flew in, I went and said, okay, I want to have the traditional foods of the area anytime I go to another location. So I went and had soft-shell crab. And while I was I ate it, and I think they said, 4 or 5 is probably the typical amount you'd want. And they asked me if I wanted it from the local area or if I wanted it from far away. I said, no, from the local area. And then I met with the health leaders the next day, and they explained that the advisory warnings were so high that they couldn't have more than 1 soft-shell crab within a few months' time. So I far exceeded the amount just in one evening. But along the lines, they also discussed how the cancer rates have soared within their communities, and that no one's really looked at that. They said almost every family has been hit by cancer, that even their traditional animals on the land now have growths on them, that people are harvesting deer that have tumors. They're eating them as well. They are shrimping people, so they still gather their foods from the lands, even though they were told it's been contaminated. It's still something traditional to them, and that's their livelihood, and so that's how they're able to eat. Now, the implications for health, as you can imagine, have been quite profound for the Homa Nation. In particular, this trauma, which we know increases the risk of addiction, which they're having addiction problems, lack of access to services. People couldn't even make it to healthcare services, unfortunately, and they weren't able to get to other services offered by the nation in particular because of the loss of access due to land erosion. There's also an inability for the women to continue connecting the community to the ancestors. Also, there was a loss of ability for them to be the leaders that they wanted to be within their community, and to decrease the health risks. In particular, water is life. That's a common phrase among Indigenous people as well. And what we found was that through the polluted waters, that there was a loss of traditional foods, of course, being unable to gather those foods, and the foods no longer being available. I visited a territory in which there were only dead trees all around what used to be lush forests. And they also had a destruction of their cultural ways of knowing and being. And the women in particular were really struck with they weren't even able to eat the fish, especially if they were childbearing age. And so this was really a harm that they thought was a large injustice for them they wanted to correct at some level. But they also had a lot of protective factors, I will say. They had their elders there. They also had interpersonal relationships with water. They still got out in their pirogues and canoed quite a bit. They also had a desire to relearn their cultural ways and to continue working and living on the land. So we co-developed the health intervention, which we would retrace these ancestral routes. We would do a bit of, they call it pirogue, but I call it canoeing as well. And we would travel across their ancestral ways and try to get back in touch with what their original instructions were for health and well-being. And they really wanted to do something around family strengthening, traditional healing, and a community outreach program. And they did a bit of surveying within their community before this point. So we designed this returning to our roots. We decided we would walk portions of the routes. We would also do canoeing. It'd be 12-day outdoor experiential, which we would be camping upon the land, getting back in touch with the land and the waters. We were going to pilot it among 20 Homa Nation women. And their focus wanted to be on reducing BMI. We did a bit of biometrics and biometric surveys as well before we went on our journey. But really, they wanted to focus on increasing some of the healthy food habits as well as increasing physical activities. And we did a bit of qualitative interviews at the end. Now you'll see in this picture, this is actually the tribal chief who would come and help paddle some of the ladies at different points along the way. He also would come and cook for the women along our journey, which I thought was a strong testament to his support of the women in particular. We visited a lot of their mounds and waterways, their sacred lands, really focusing on the ancestors' original instructions for healthy living. We also visited a lot of the massacre sites and removal sites, which were very difficult for the women. But at the same time, it offered an opportunity to heal, which they did so through focusing on the ancestors' love and instituting a form of ceremony at each site. They also had ceremonial sites on the water and near the water that we were able to visit. And we visited the French consulate and recognized those relationships because the United Homa Nation differs from the Choctaw Nation that they did blend a bit with the French culture. They actually have a different language now that's blended with French and Choctaw, similar to Métis here. Now, along the way, we identified some barriers to their health. One of the barriers I saw when I was on the canoe, we had a alligator attacking our canoe. And as I said, oh, you just got too close to her nest, you'll be just fine. And I was thinking, oh my goodness. But we also found some other barriers to them being healthy. And part of that was around time and time management. They recognized that the barriers around this current lifestyle and ways of being harmed them in their ability to stay healthy. They also had this awareness of the relationships with food, with water, with land, but especially around food and overeating or having a couple of the participants described it as a domestic violence type relationship, that it wasn't healthy, they knew it wasn't healthy, but they were still engaging in this unhealthy relationship with junk foods and what have you because they lacked access to healthy foods. They also wanted to eat with others. They found that eating with others is healthy and that in their modern day lifestyle, they started eating in solitary situations. And they wanted to change that. This is our bus that we took along our route that we're often in. And unfortunately, when we went on our 12-day experiential wilderness therapy event, we had a lot of tornadoes come through the area. At one point, we did have to seek refuge in a cabin. I was unfortunately the only scientist in the group with the ladies, and as soon as the electricity went on, I'm frantically trying to get cell phone reception, asked someone, my colleague who was helping, to please look up if there's a tornado on the way. I know we're in a watch, and the ladies didn't blink an eye. As soon as the electricity went out, we were doing medicine pouches, and they just calmly raised their headlamps up, switched them on, and kept right on sewing. Right. So these women are very resilient, and I think through going through a lot of trauma, they've learned to be resilient and to keep moving forward. Reconnecting with their ancestral waters actually caused a shift within the community. They really increased their Homa Nation identity and pride. They increased their connection to the ancestors. I mean, overall, it was a great experience to increase their mindfulness towards health. They also were able to create space within place. right? So we visited some sites that were quite discriminatory even today. A lot of racism occurs within Louisiana and the States, but they were still able to create space to recognize the Mother Earth, to recognize their sacred waterways, and to have ceremony within that space, and to bond with each other to continue their culture through those ways. This is a group of the women. This is actually in the middle of New Orleans. They have a ceremonial stomp grounds there, which is one of their very sacred dances. And it was used as a slave center later on, and so they were able to do a bit of reclaiming themselves. Now, there's also a big emphasis on the ancestors' roles. So one of the beliefs around water, and which we know to be true, is that every ounce that we drink or drop that we see has been passed on through our ancestors. So our ancestors, have had some kind of contact with that water, or that's our belief, right? And so as we drink the water and it passes through us, we hope that the future generations will have contact with that water. And embedded in that water is knowledge. And so they really had a lot of discussions around the ancestors' roles with health and well-being. A lot of focus on vision, sacrifice, and happiness, and the ability to spiritually connect to the ancestors through the water and the land. Now, ceremony was very important. This is just a drawing of a stomp dance. We were able to actually have a stomp dance during our walk, which they hadn't held in many, many years, so that was a form of revitalization. So not only was there reclamation of land and waterways during this process, but there was revitalization of cultural practices and ceremonies, which the women found was very important to them, especially as they became leaders of health and wanting to promote health within their community. And through this process, we also developed a framework for health. And really, what we found was that cultural continuity, which we know through the research, increases one's health, right? The more you're able to practice your culture, the more you're able to increase your spirituality and your identity, the more likely you're going to have better health outcomes, lower risks of addiction, and be able to cope with the trauma that's going on in life. Well, the women found that through going back to their ancestral place and creating space within that place for their culture, their traditions, they were able to connect with their ancestors and form catalysts of change to reconnect to spiritual healing and reaffirm their resilience and increase their resilience in the face of adversity, as well as continue their ceremonies to maintain health today. Now, the implications for practice for the home and nation in particular is that they've used this information to design some other health interventions. They're really focused now on the youth in their communities and designing similar programs to help their youth become more resilient and to reclaim a lot more of their culture and keep that going. We also know that because of the mass trauma they're currently facing, even with the relocation of the island, trying to figure out what to do right now, they have a lot of adversity, but at the same time, through focusing on those ancestors' original instructions and getting back to their culture, they're able to build that hope and focus on the love of their ancestors to continue hope for the future generations. Okay, so I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michelle. It's an awesome story. I look forward to discussing that more with you. Next, we have Dr. Patrick Lloyd Smith here from the University of Saskatchewan. He's an assistant professor in water and resource economics with the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department. He is a member of the Global Institute for Water Security as well. And outside of his academic work, Pat has consulted on numerous economics projects for Canadian governments and for the World Bank. So today, Pat's going to give us a little bit more of the economist's view of how they think about ecosystem services and highlight some of his work on the public benefits of reducing boil water advisories in Alberta. Welcome, Pat.
All right. Thanks for having me here, Holly and Corinne, and thanks for coming. Economist, talking ecosystem services. It does exist. Next 10 minutes, I'm hoping to provide kind of half the time I'll spend on a little bit of kind of how economists think of ecosystem services, especially as it comes to how we think about maybe valuing ecosystem services. And then, as Holly mentioned, I'll kind of dive in on a case study looking at boil water advisories and some of the benefits that might accrue to different types of folks coming from reducing boil water advisories. So what are ecosystem services? I like this definition, just sort of the benefits to humans from nature. There's a lot of semantic arguments of sort of what is an ecosystem service, what's not. But I think it's really on that connection of the benefits that we're getting from nature. There's a few different types. People try and categorize them in different ways. And Corinne mentioned a few different ones at the beginning. And a lot of these benefits, we can think about describing them kind of qualitatively as good water quality, bad water quality. Maybe we would try and go out and quantify some of these ecosystem service endpoints. Maybe if we're looking at recreation, we'd have sort of number of fishing days associated with a specific lake, sort of a nice quantity. Or we might even want to value some ecosystem services and try and think about sort of what are people's preferences for them and how are they sort of valuing them. Many different ways to conceive of values in general, and there's a lot of different interdisciplinary work on that front. What sort of separates kind of the economist take on it is we're going to be trying to use economic theory to try and quantify changes in well-being for humans. So we're going to be trying to base our numbers on sort of some underlying theory connected to economics. And one of the key principles from economic valuation is it's often about trade-offs. So the trade-offs people are willing to make to either give up resources or to accept new resources in exchange for ecosystem services. And right away we can start thinking of some of the limitations of the economic approach to ecosystem services, because if there are no real trade-offs to make, or if people are uncomfortable making these sort of trade-offs, that's going to be a real challenge for using these types of approaches. So when we think of all the different ecosystem services, some are going to be maybe more amenable to kind of economic valuation. Other ones, that's maybe not the best approach to do. And the bottom line for the method overall is just because it doesn't have a market price doesn't mean people don't care about it. People care about tons of things that they're not out buying and selling in the marketplace. The challenge is how can we uncover that value that people have for these different ecosystem services. So that's sort of one of the challenges with ecosystem service valuation. Heidi was telling me earlier that she had some good stories in her presentation, not too scientific, and I said, I have no stories in my presentation, it's just sort of like a lecture, so this is sort of the counterpart to it. Here's my beautiful clip art skills in PowerPoint. You know, I don't get paid for that. But we can kind of think about an intervention happens, sort of a project goes forward, maybe government implements a policy, that's going to lead to a change in the ecosystem. Maybe a change in water quality, maybe a change in air quality, depending on the ecosystem. That change in the ecosystem or in our natural environment is going to lead to a change in an ecosystem service, or sort of the specific endpoint that humans actually care about. So that could be sort of change in water quality, leading to better fish environments, and that's going to lead to increased fishing trips. So sort of that fishing trips might be what humans are interested in. But there could be a whole host of them, even health impacts for a lot of air pollution. We worry about sort of asthma days or other sort of challenges with air pollution, so there could be some health associated with it. Once we sort of have that ecosystem service endpoint, let's try and assess what are people's preferences for, what are their values they attach to these different ecosystem services, and what is sort of the change in well-being associated with a different project or policy. And I kind of highlight it here is this process is inherently interdisciplinary. So you have sort of the natural scientists helping us figure out these connections between maybe a change in water quality and change in fish populations. And then we have a whole host of different social scientists trying to understand what ecosystem services do people care about and what are their sort of preferences associated with it. So it's sort of a very interdisciplinary aspect, and especially on that sort of quantifying what an ecosystem service is. And there's this sort of tension between something that's captures the underlying science, but also that things that people care about and things that people can understand when we're talking about these trade-offs. I think historically a lot of the ecosystem services that have been sort of quantified and valued, especially when it comes to recreation, has been very sort of male-dominated activities, sort of fishing and some of these different outdoor activities that tend to be more male-dominated. So I think thinking seriously about sort of what ecosystem services that we care about is sort of a nice first step going forward. All right, So what's nice about sort of an economic approach to this? Well, if we're interested in trade-offs, and if this project has costs, we might want to be comparing them to benefits. And the three sort of advantages I see of economic valuation: easy to interpret, they have some sort of consistency in their measures, and they can be comparable. What do I mean by that? Well, we tend to use sort of dollar amounts. And a lot of controversy for using dollar amounts, but they're also sort of something that decision makers can interpret and have a clear meaning for, as well as they can be compared to project costs. So if we're looking at sort of evaluating what are the costs and benefits of a project, often the projects themselves are in dollar amounts, so we can compare to that. So that's kind of nice. They're consistent across all different types of projects. So no matter what type of project or impact or ecosystem service you're interested in, you can use sort of a similar approach, as well as sort of across individuals, regions. So I think that's an open question. You know, I think for some folks this will be more amenable to, and other ones it might not be. But underlying all this, this is just one approach and one piece of information that can feed into the decision-making process. Of course, there's a whole host of other metrics that people might care about, and so this is just sort of one complementary piece of information. All right, that was a little bit of background. What's sort of the case study? So we were interested in reducing boil water advisories, and how we came across this project was there's a lot of concern about, in Alberta, about forest fires in their watershed, burning trees. This is how they explain it to me, and then I have to try and keep up with it. Burning trees, and then you get a rainfall afterwards. Bunch of sediment comes into the river, flows downstream, and maybe knocks out the drinking water treatment facility. Then people have to do a boil water advisory. Or maybe it doesn't totally knock it out, but maybe it just sort of overwhelms it so they can't keep up with the increased sediment, so the government puts out a boil water advisories. Obviously, this is not the cause of all boil water advisories. A lot of them just come from sort of just difficulties with the drinking water system, but there's sort of this kind of chain of events that, that this project was a part of, and we were working with a bunch of forest ecologists and hydrologists looking at the sort of science on the watershed side, and we were coming in on sort of the boil water advisory side. So again, we kind of have this story of how we end up from what's happening in our watersheds and our source water to what people care about. And in this case, we're a whole host of different things that the watershed provides. We're just interested in sort of water reliability. How reliable are people's water supply, as well as sort of what are the costs to them of having a boil water advisory or a boil water advisory occurring in the province. And we can imagine, and I think we started this project back in 2013 when boil water advisories wasn't quite as much in the news as they are now. But I mean, I think now people have a really much better understanding of sort of some of the causes and some of the issues associated with it. And a lot of the focus is on the kind of cost to the local community that are experiencing these boil water advisories, and for good reason, because these are the people that are in many ways on the front lines of that. But often these are occurring in very small communities, under 500 people. And the costs of upgrading their drinking water treatment facility or doing this sort of vegetation management can be quite extensive, you know. And so one of the aspects we're interested in this research is outside of the local community, where we can see there's going to be a clear cost, what about people in urban areas? Do they care about boil water advisories occurring in their province? And not just do they care in terms of a sense of, yeah, I care, you know. Would they be willing to dig into their pockets and pony up and share some of this financial burden? Because it could be millions of dollars to stop some of these boil water advisories. So we were kind of interested in not just for the local communities, but the broader public. And in general, we can kind of think there's sort of two types of economic values. We kind of jump them into use values. This would be the folks in the communities that are really directly affected by boil water advisories. But then there could be this broader sort of non-use value. So even though people aren't directly affected by boil water advisories, they still get a well-being impact when these occur in maybe communities they care about or in their own province. And when we were developing some of this work, doing focus groups, that came up quite often. Sort of, I'm ashamed to live in Alberta because we have boil water advisories. not everyone has access to clean water. These are folks in downtown Calgary, you know. So trying to uncover what are the benefits to them of reducing boil water advisories was sort of one of the aspects of their work. What do? Establish a good project team, working with Diane DuPont and Vic Adamovich. And I'll just mention for Diane DuPont, she's been a mentor of mine for a few years. She's kind of Canada's best water economist working on these types of issues. She did a lot of the early work on gender issues and environmental valuation and doing some of the pioneer work there. An amazing economist and just all-around great person to work with. I know some other folks in the audience have worked with her as well, so I think they'll agree with that. So she's been really a path blazer in economics and especially for valuation work as well. And I know it's bad in hydrology, sort of the male imbalance, but it's even worse in economics, if you can imagine. So, but Diane's been at it for a long time and doing great work. So what were we doing? So we were doing a survey. We're going to develop one, design one. Took about 2 years to put together. Asking Albertans sort of their preferences for different water management strategies. Talked to about 1,400 folks. Did that over online. What were we doing? Well, we were trying to put them in a voting situation where they are voting between the current situation with about 55 boil water advisories that occur in the province any given year, or sort of a proposed program that the government would implement that would reduce the number of boil water advisories, either through investments in vegetation management or in drinking water treatment facility. If you go with just the status quo, it doesn't cost you anything. But if we want to kind of reduce boil water advisories, that's going to cost the government some money. So people sort of had this trade-off between sort of increased tax bill and reducing boil water advisories. And we use responses to a bunch of different types of questions like this to try and understand what are people willing to give up to reduce boil water advisories in different types of communities, small communities, large communities, or medium-sized communities. And anytime you're doing a survey, I know everyone in this room would be truthful if I did a survey with you, but if you can believe it, people out there, sometimes they lie to you on surveys. And so that's going to be a big challenge for us because we're trying to understand what are people actually willing to give up to reduce boil water advisories. So we spend a lot of time trying to get around issues like this of just what do you do in these sort of cases. And so that's where the 2 years on the survey development side, bunch of different methods that we try to ensure that the responses we get reflect what people would actually do in that scenario. Because that's always going to be a bit of a challenge, but this is also kind of fun to go around and study that. So we do a bunch of different things to try and get as truthful as responses as possible. All right, end off, what do we find? So one of the interesting aspects is, in general, people in Alberta willing to pay maybe about $1.50, an extra $3.50 a year in taxes to reduce one boil water advisory in a small community. Well, not that much money. We aggregate that up over the number of households in Alberta, well, then it's about $2.5 to $5.5 million. That's starting to get pretty substantial, right? And this is what people would pay to reduce sort of one boil water advisory in a small community. And what's interesting is that is we find this occurs for people in urban areas that don't face as much of a boil water advisory threat, although they've had a few recently in Alberta and some of their bigger towns. But in general, they're a bit more safe. They have a bit more modern drinking water treatment plant. But even folks in urban areas or in larger communities were willing to shoulder some of this financial burden of reducing boil water advisories. So I think this kind of non-use benefits are expanding our conception of who's really benefiting from some of these ecosystem services is an important part of the story. And then also we find female respondents have a higher willingness to pay. And this is a very common finding in the environmental valuation literature, and no one really knows what to do with it. And we're just kind of scratching at the surface. It kind of comes up, and not much research is in this area of really understanding why and some of the mechanisms for why. So I think that's sort of an open area of research, and I'd be interested in anyone's thoughts of sort of why that might be the case in this context. As well as we kind of asked people, would you prefer if we did this through watershed management practices, or changing your forestry, or sort of more traditional gray infrastructure, upgrading the treatment plant. And it seemed like people didn't really care. They said, as long as they're being reduced, we don't really care. And I think there's some sort of trade-off with the green infrastructure. It's kind of always like fun and it's always in the news, but there's a lot of reliability concerns. People didn't really trust it to do the job that it is set out to do. When it comes to drinking water, people want assurances. So I think there's some concerns there with that. So I'll just end off by saying, I think it's a really exciting time for ecosystem service research in general. I think part of it because of the interdisciplinary aspect, as well as just no matter the issue you work on, it's always policy relevant. This ecosystem service language, I think, is just becoming more and more popular for decision makers to help conceptualize the broader benefits we get from nature. Chatted a little bit about sort of the economic approach to this, but I think there's still tons of work to do to deepen our understanding, especially on gender and economic valuation. And I think we're really just kind of scratching the surface at it, not doing that great of a job. So I think that's one area of increased work for us. Lots of opportunities to apply it, but then I think this last bullet is also really important. You know, this is just one framework to understanding the human-nature relationship. There's many others, and each of them equally valid. This is just sort of one way to look at it. But I think really there's sort of a diversity of approaches when we come to something like ecosystem services because it's such a complex kind of beast. So I'll leave it there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate that. Some thought-provoking and interesting presentation material. Can I invite you to sit at the table? I'm going to hand it over to you, the audience, to ask any questions of one or all of the panelists. There's a microphone that will be coming around. Because we're live casting this, we do need to use the microphones, please. And so if you do have a question, just let us know. While you're thinking and deciding which question you want to ask first, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask one of my own and give you that time. We also, as we have people online, if you want to engage in the questions and answers, if you tweet with the hashtag #WomenAndWater, we have someone who's following that Twitter feed and who will take any questions and bring them to us as well and address them to the panelists. So that's hashtag #WomenAndWater. So let me ask the three of you a general question that is, how do you affect change from which services to value, and that male-dominated kind of assessment and decision-making around which services, ecosystem services in particular, are more valuable, to how do you scale out some of this land-based healing to allow other, particularly women, to engage in these activities that clearly make such a big difference in people's lives, to engaging young females in research activities in the communities that you're working with. So perhaps you'd like to answer that question. As I say, then we'll be open to everyone else.
Thank you for your question. I think that's a wonderful question to ask because, especially in Indigenous communities, Indigenous women feel very beholden and inspired to help correct a lot of the trauma that's occurred to the land and the water. Part of it's our role as women and water carriers, but really there's been a large grassroots movement of Indigenous women and within communities to come together and try to effect change. And as a Indigenous woman scientist, I feel like it's my role just to work with them and support them how I can in obtaining grants and funding to continue the great work they're doing, to really provide that space within academia, but as well as within science in general, for them to have a voice and to affect change. Even if it's around, I know fracking's come up a lot, especially with my own tribal community. The Choctaw Nation is said to be one of the highest fracked areas within the United States. Our sacred waters and springs have continued to be polluted. Unfortunately, our community members continue to utilize these waters for sweats and other ceremonies. So there's been a big push to start looking at some of these ill health effects from water and from the pollution of land in particular. So for me, I feel like part of it's inspiring young women, especially from my community, home communities and other Indigenous communities, to start thinking about careers as researchers, as scientists, also as activists. I mean, there's a lot of Indigenous women activists, and I think they do some phenomenal work. I actually see my own research as a form of activism. And I speak a lot with my students currently about creating a research manifesto and what kind of work you want to do throughout your career and how that can be inspiring and affect change within our society.
That's difficult to follow up on. I'm going to tackle a couple parts of that. Obviously, I'm not Indigenous. So my role, I really see in my research program, I would say since about the mid-2000s, especially in the North, there's been a real movement to, you are invited to help participate in a project or help empower in a particular capacity building exercise. You don't impose yourself on a particular nation or group of people or lands. And so to the best of my ability, we do try as best we can to, hey, Heidi, can you help us out on a canoe trip that we're doing for a couple of weeks to learn water quality monitoring? Or can you come up and help with developing skills for developing an exploratory fishery? So DFO wants to have an exploratory fishery, but it requires data that folks aren't trained in doing. I see that as part of my role and in affecting change. And as part of affecting change, we were talking at lunch a little bit about making choices. And as a pre-tenure prof in a hard science, there's a cost to me doing that. Like, that's not, it might be counted, but it's not a paper. It doesn't get a Google Scholar citation if you value those sorts of things. So I think part of affecting change is just showing that the box is as big as you make it. And there are ways to reach outside of the traditional metrics and still be successful enough to make it over whatever standards your institution has. The second part about affecting change structurally, I'm a co-I on my first time I've been a co-I on a SSHRC grant, which is really exciting for me. And it's going to be a workshop in Edmonton on a position paper that we've developed, writing to the tri-agency councils about how to better allow land-based research. And because a lot of the barriers to getting excellent work done on the land are really small, like administrative hurdles that would be really easily fixed if there was will at the highest levels. Just things like, I need to pay my Indigenous assistants in cash every single day. They cannot take the online animal care course because that's totally culturally inappropriate and a form of colonialism. Things like this, I think, are important to champion to higher levels.
All right. Yeah, great question. I think when we're talking about ecosystem services, I think there's just a growing recognition of the role of gender in the selection of these. So I think what we can do to kind of broaden that perspective, so we're beyond just sort of fishing, hunting, and some of these more male-dominated ones. But I think also in terms of the type of cost it imposes on folks. And one example from economics is when we talk about people's value for their time. Often we use their wage rate. And that's sort of, we conceptualize, that's how they would value their time. And if they're unemployed, we slap a big zero on that. Or if they're out of the workforce or have a more tangential relationship with the workforce, they may get just a value of zero. That's probably not true. So trying to really understand what are these time costs or what are these sort of other sort of non-monetary costs imposed on folks, I think is another kind of aspect that can help out there. Yeah.
Thank you. Over to you. That wasn't a question.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for your talks today. They were excellent. I kind of wanted to get on the personal side a bit. This came up yesterday in a discussion with other female faculty about travel and being a prof and how that works for you, especially if you have children. How do you kind of manage that homework balance, especially if you have field-based research programs or you need to travel a lot to conferences?
Well, having 4 children and actually a 2-year-old at the moment, but as well as a 19-year-old, 17-year-old, 13-year-old, traveling is a bit difficult. Prior to coming to the University of Saskatchewan, I founded and directed a research center, Research for Indigenous Community Health, and it was international in focus as well, so it meant a lot of traveling. Also, the work that I currently do, I run a randomized clinical trial with the Choctaw Nation with my colleague, Dr. Karina Walters at University of Washington in Seattle, and so there's a lot of travel involved with land-based healing. As you mentioned, travel up to your tribal communities. But I have worked through that with taking my children as I can. So with the teenagers, that's not such a big deal nowadays because they're happy to stay home and spend time with other relatives. But my partner is also a research scientist who works with tribal communities on the land, typically around food medicine. And so we've had to do quite a bit of juggling back and forth. But with my health intervention in particular, my youngest has come in utero to the health intervention for a couple of weeks. He's walked the Trail of Tears with us. He's come, as a baby, then as a 1-year-old, and now this will be probably his final time as a 2-year-old to travel with us. Just because we're camping outside, it's very hot. There's lots of mosquitoes and ticks and snakes and lots of tornadoes that come through at that time of year. So it will be his last time, but I've always found ways to do so with hiring someone to come with me, with trying to hire a local person to come with me and give them adequate pay that they're okay to watch him. Also just, making sure that when I'm home, I really devote time to the family at that time. And saying no, it has become okay with me. For a while, I felt like I had to take on everything and wasn't able to say no if a community asked something of me. And I just really had to become more secure in realizing, I would give them my best and my all when it was probably a shorter amount of time and when the timing was right. Now, at the same time, there's been a balance of trying to get publications out because, especially when you're working with communities, it's really hard to wrap up a research project if you're not there and if you're not with them, and especially around dissemination. I always try to co-author with my community partners, which means I have to fly to them and make sure they've read what I'm writing. Or, we talk about the analyses together. And so that's become a bit slower than if I didn't have children, for instance, or a family. And so to cope with that, I've actually done a bit of secondary data analysis on the side throughout my career to get tenure. I was sure that I tried to keep that going at all times so that I could whip out those publications and then spend more time on my community publications as well as travel with that.
Yeah, a lot of that rings really true for me. I don't have a family, and we were speaking at lunchtime about, as groups of women, how we can support each other. So, for example, I will often take on more travel so that my colleagues who need to stay home can stay home. And then we kind of trade off. So, hey, can you sit on another couple of committees if I can go and do this more extensive travel? But certainly working with communities, the data research is not published because it's 8 nations, and the results need to be communicated to them first and foremost, and it's a dialogue back and forth about what we're going to publish. So it's the field time in the summer, but then in the winter, I usually fly up to all the communities and meet with chief and council and harvesters. And same sort of strategy. While doing that, I published a paper on a new method for quantifying probabilistic niches in ecology, which didn't require any field work. In terms of balancing, though, I think that one thing that often I think we could improve on in academia is supporting each other across genders. So yeah, can we trade off some of these different costs and tasks, especially related to travel?
Yeah, I think for myself, definitely there is sort of the sense of this academic rat race with travel, and you do feel like you need to kind of be everywhere, and especially early on in your career. And so I think we all face that, and I think one of the aspects is just being okay with not encouraging that. And I think especially as it comes to graduate students, and I try and do this with my graduate students, is all travel is optional, in terms of if it's not necessary for the project or if it's just for a presentation, not trying to impose sort of your own sort of conception of, oh yeah, that's so important to travel on other folks. And I think changing some of the dialogues around there, I think, can be important for kind of allowing space of, no, you don't need to be running around all the time because we all face different constraints. Yeah.
Thank you.
How are we doing for time?
I didn't bring my phone up.
I don't have mine either.
We have all the time in the
All
world.
right, let's get one more then.
Were there any online? No? Okay. I'm happy to close it off and go to networking because that's where people can ask individuals different questions. And as Jay noticed, there were cookies. He left early, so there may no longer be cookies. And it wasn't his idea. But anyway, we do have cookies and coffee and tea. Our speakers are going to be around. One of the elements that we set aside time for was to be able to network, to be able to ask those questions. So please stay around, hang out, enjoy the cookies, and thank you ever so much, all of you, for coming. We really appreciate it. And before that, I really need to thank Mark and Morgan, who are the people behind the scenes on every single Women in Water event that we have, posters, setting up, interfacing, and thank you for the live streaming team as well. We really appreciate that. And without all of you behind the scenes, Holly and I wouldn't be able to stand up here and interact with the speakers in the way that we do. So thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. The next lecture is going to be later this month, the 29th. Thank you very much. And it's all around knowledge mobilization. So women, water, and water research knowledge mobilization. So we hope you can be here. It'll be the same time, same place, and we'll have coffee and cookies. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good day.